Hi friends, host Eric here, host Talking with Friends People. I want to make this video called Apologist versus Advocate. Now, interestingly, if you define the two terms, apologist and advocate basically mean the same thing, denotively. A person who offers an argument in defense of something controversial is the only difference between an apologist and an advocate. The thing is, connotatively, the word apologist is used to refer to people who make arguments in defense of stuff that shouldn't be defended, basically. That's what connotative its connotation is, but denotatively, I guess it doesn't necessarily mean that. Regardless, earlier today we had an argument about Trump's immigration policy. I said one example of why Trump was a terrible president was his family separation policy of illegal immigrants. So, context here. Well, there were a couple of contexts. It was the immigration detention and it was the assassination of the Iranian general. So, this is what happened during the course of the debate. Basically, I was saying Trump was a terrible president and a horrible person. And the other parties who are arguing against me, which included Leaf Trimmer and Raphael to a certain extent, and Clayton McCormick, were arguing in defense of him. And my basic position was that either the assassination or the immigration detention policies proved my central thesis, which was that Trump is a criminal, murderer, and beyond being a murderer is somebody who is a deplorable human being. So these were the responses by them that I got in general, the warrants that I heard during the course of this argument. I put A here, illegal immigrants have committed a crime. I never actually heard that stated explicitly by anybody, but it's an assumption upon which a lot of stuff is predicated, so I just went ahead and put it there. The rest of them are all arguments that people made. Obama killed more people than Trump. Totally not responsive or relevant to my argument about Trump. I'm not defending Obama, I'm attacking Trump. This response: Obama made the immigration policy, Trump was just implementing it. So this is like specious to say the least, right? It's somebody who's looking for any excuse at all to absolve Trump of critique. Because even if Obama did make the immigration policy, obviously Trump was empowered as president to implement this as he saw fit, and in fact made an explicit point to go out of his way to be hardcore about immigration, right? D. Trump just separated families to address human trafficking problems. Okay, and I'm gonna deal with this issue last because it's the most substantive of all the arguments. Okay. Somebody argued, well, Trump's the one who ended catch and release. Well, my position is that catch and release is the preferable course of action. That it's true, it doesn't do much to dissuade immigration, but illegal immigration. But my position on that is that we're putting the onus on the wrong side. That if we really want to secure the border, we should secure the border rather than trying to round up people after the fact. I've also been accused of making an appeal to emotion because I acted out the experience of a child and parents being separated from each other. But of course, the thing is, I didn't make an appeal to emotion. I made an appeal to common sense there, and when I said, why is it that we shouldn't just believe people who are clearly indicating to the border control people that they are a family, that there's no reason to believe they're not a family, that every indication of the behavior might naturally say this child is agonized over being separated from their parents. Wouldn't that be sufficient to conclude that they're not human trafficking victims? Regardless, I'll get to my warrants in a second. There's also the warrant made by Raphael that being nice to illegal aliens just encourages illegal immigration. And H, If they don't want to be separated, they shouldn't come across illegally. They should come across legally. Then there were additional warrants by Clayton, and this is worth noting here. So Clayton then texted me and said, "There's no reason to assume that they didn't interview them. There's no reason to conclude that the families that they separated weren't separated because they were suspicious." Okay, so again, I'm gonna get to this last issue last. And then he pointed out airport stuff that, I'm not thinking about the airports. Airports and the borders, they are very careful with kids and stuff. Well, of course, as a matter of fact, I am aware that if a child travels with somebody who's not their biological parent, that they can establish that it's their biological parent, there's a lot of protocols you got to go through. I know this because my parents, my child's grandparents, took her on vacations and stuff, and every time that they did so, we had to fill out some paperwork, and both parents had to agree that it was acceptable, and they had to say how long they were going to be gone for, and they get checked at the borders for that stuff too, to make sure that they're not taking children across illegally. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's a good thing for them to be careful about that kind of stuff. Okay? So, here were the warrants by me before we finally get back to the most significant arguments being made here. Okay? Here are the warrants by me. Crimes are committed against people or property, so illegal immigration isn't really a crime so much as it is a violation of a rule or a law. It's an illegality, but not a crime. Now, it could be a crime if the person who crosses the border onto private land. If they cross the border onto private land, then they are guilty of trespassing as an actual crime against property, quote unquote. But the thing is, it's a crime against property that that confers no damages onto either the person or their property besides having their border violated. So, of course, any kind of punishment for such a thing would have to be proportional to that. We factor utilitarianism in when considering the severity of the punishment, not when considering guilt or innocence. Okay, my other point was that the onus should be on the U.S. to secure the border rather than round up those who cross an unsecured border. If we're going to do the latter, why not do the former? Winston's mom pointed out that it's very challenging to genuinely secure 2,000 miles of border that crosses all sorts of different terrain and blah, 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 blah. And that may be the case, but at that point, we're probably looking at a multi-approach system with various layered redundancies, I guess. My point is that family separation is wicked. It's unjustified with the trafficking claim. My point in the video was that it's easily solved by interviewing parties separately. You don't need to have them locked away from each other for long periods of time. And that these families were separated in order to verify, but there was no verification protocol in place when the separation was done. In other words, if you're going to separate me because you want to vaccinate me, let's say, you better have vaccines. Otherwise, you're just separating me and holding me because you're not ready, right? My point number 2 is that it's straight up wicked, indefensible. In this regard, I tried to demonstrate what it's like for a child to be separated from their parents, and I was accused of doing an appeal to emotion. Well, when addressing the question of whether something's straight up wicked, I think it's appropriate evidence. I mean, the idea of holding people's children hostage as a means of anything, frankly, is supervillain behavior. And then Winston's mom, the reason I have an asterisk on here is this is not my warrant, but it's under the category warrants by me. But Winston's mom's warrant was actually, it's in official documents, been explicitly described as being driven by the desire to deter future immigration. And you'll notice, of course, some of these arguments here seem to try to play both sides of the field, in the sense that if in fact it's justified exclusively by trafficking, does that mean there's an acknowledgement that it would otherwise be wicked? Well, the thing is, at the end of the day, this trafficking argument is both weak and it's unacceptable for the same reason that a lot. Okay, so look, I'm guessing Clayton is somebody who doesn't love the COVID lockdowns, and of course, the reason he doesn't love them, he's probably will say, is that maybe he might say, one of the reasons he might say is that the onus is on the wrong party. That the government shouldn't be telling every individual that because they don't know if they are sick or not, that they have to stay home because we have to presume that you are. In other words, we don't know who in this group of Mexicans is guilty of human trafficking. So we'll lock them all up until we figure it out. Now, Clayton would say, well, you don't know they locked them all up. Maybe they did make a select determination of the thing. I guess that would be the key determining point then. If, in fact, the people that they separated and locked up were a select subset of the total number of immigrants, and if, in fact, the people they selected to lock up and separate were selected exclusively because there were indications that they were suspicions of human trafficking that were well justified, then a certain amount of imposition upon those individuals' liberty pending verification of their authenticity is legitimate. But if they had been U.S. citizens, there'd be a limit to how long they can be held before they have to be either charged or released, right? And because they're not U.S. citizens, they are protected by those constitutional protections. So Clayton McCormick is saying, I'm okay doing to Mexicans what I would never be okay with doing to Americans. Namely, locking them up indefinitely pending our determination of a verification method and locking up proactively all the people because some of them might be guilty. It's if we don't make our arguments with principles that we apply consistently, at least mostly, there's a good chance we're being an apologist. I don't believe, in general, Clayton would argue that we should lock up large groups of people when we know that a subset of those people are or might be guilty of a crime, no matter how heinous that crime is. It's better to let the guilty be free than to lock up the innocent. It's a fundamental principle of American democracy. And the interesting thing is, I'm quite confident that none of those individuals would have made that decision themselves. It feels to me, and this is not definitive argument of any sort, but it feels to me as though Trump said, I want to punish those people and make them hurt. So, you want to come to America illegally? Fine. Kids in that cell block, parents in that cell block. That's what it feels like to me. And it's representative of a kind of entitlement that is absolutely disgusting to me. It says, it suggests to me that we were dealing with a president who had no problem reducing others to a means to an end. He had no problem using those people to make his point. He had no problem using their suffering as a general policy towards deterrence or something. I find that appalling. Sometimes, as a president, a person is going to have to make decisions that cause suffering. And sometimes, as a president, a person is going to be positioned to execute a given matter in ways that minimize suffering. If a president sort of seems to take glee in the former and not take advantage of opportunities of the latter sort, you really have to wonder if he's an okay human being. Now, on the other issue, the assassination, my point was that Trump's a horrible human being. He's a murderer. He killed in cold blood. There was no legal justification for that murder. No international law justifies it. All international law prohibits it. We are not in a state of war with Iran. He's not an enemy combatant. Nothing justified it legally. That makes it murder. And in response, I was told, well, you know, so and so, who was it? I don't remember. I mean, one of the examples was Clinton being a terrible husband, cheating on his wife with Monica Lewinsky and probably many others. And I pointed out that was not under the auspices of his job as president. Right? It matters. If Bill Clinton may have been a scumbag in his day-to-day life, but he didn't do a bad job as being president. And that's what we need to evaluate presidents on. Whether or not they do a good job of being president. Like, Jimmy Carter has had a wonderful impact on the world since ceasing to be president. We don't pretend that made him a good president. He was incredibly weak. So, and we don't conflate the two things. Ted Kennedy was involved in the death of a young woman that's extremely shady. But he didn't write legislation in Congress to make it happen. Right? So, no matter how awful of a human being someone is, and it may be like I would never vote for that person. They're an awful human being, but being an awful human being as president means you're being an awful human being in the name of all of us. So it wasn't just Trump who is a murderer now. It's, to a certain extent, every single one of us bears some bit of that murder. At least to the extent that we validate it, apologize for it, or think it's okay. I do not hate Trump because I'm a liberal. I do not hate Trump because I wish a Democrat had won. No matter how much I hate Trump, I still maintain I'm glad Trump won over Hillary. No matter how much I hate Trump, I still think it would have been better to vote for Trump again than to vote for Biden, who has dementia. Why? Because at least Trump isn't literally, physically, medically incapable of doing the job. He just disrespects the job so much and has so little regard for the institutions of a citizen democracy that he does more damage to the democracy by just being in the office than any good he could possibly do, even if he did all the right things in the office. So, and yet I'd still prefer him over Biden because what is the greatest disrespect of all to the office of the presidency? To elect somebody who lacks the basic mental capacity to do the job. We can't even hold Biden responsible for when he did the terrible job. It's not his fault. We can't expect anything more of him than you would expect of my mom drooling in the nursing home at sunrise. The fact that she sometimes hits the people who are trying to help her is not her fault. We don't blame her and get mad at her for that. We can't blame and get mad at Biden for whatever crazy fucking nonsense he ends up doing. That's why I would never have elected him, right? He can't be held accountable. He is not responsible for his actions. He is not mentally competent. Trump at least is mentally competent enough to be held responsible for his actions, which are consistently rather deplorable. And of course, as a last parting gesture, what does he have to do as he leaves the office? He has to shit on the integrity of the electoral process, and try to convince us all that it was stolen from him. And not just try, successfully convince a lot of people who participate in my live streams. This is the cancer that is agenda politics. This is the cancer that is being on a team. Clayton McCormick would never in a billion years fight so hard in defense of this policy if it had been the policy of a Democratic president. He would be shitting all over it. Why? Because he's driven by team shit, agenda shit, not actual what's the best argument. If you have to bend over backwards to try to find excuses for what's obviously deplorable behavior, you are an apologist. I am not one. The end.